Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 22. A Web of Lies. The darkness lay close and heavy under the velvet dome of cloud. Without the familiar starlight, the migrants' quarter thrummed with dark suggestion, till its normally dismal appearance was touched with something of the mysterious. Sprawling just inside the southeastern wall of brick, it contained the seedier inns and less expensive animal shelters, where travelers and merchants of all types congregated for little more than a night's stay. A good proportion of the poor and lesser tradesmen of brick had drifted into this area as housing had become scarce elsewhere, increasing the number of vagabonds and cutpurses prowling the streets, as well as augmenting the mildly sophisticated squalor. The Painted Maid boasted a much greater crowd than customary, having drawn a large number of patrons from competing establishments this night. A dancing troupe from the Fez, unable to secure a more respectable venue for their performance, was currently presenting the lewder section of their range to the nightly pleasure seekers of the migrants' quarter. Many in the crowd were not native to the quarter, but from all over the city, including the most affluent sectors. The noise of their raucous appreciation rose and fell like a gusty breeze, interspersed here and there with deafening roars of approval. Yet the chorus from the many throats did little to interrupt the relentless rhythm beaten on the desert drums, and the wailing cry of several pipes that pierced the very senses, at once arousing yet setting the nerves on edge. The terrific din pulsed its way through the structure, till the dust sifted down in tiny rivulets from the rafters, and the slate roof danced almost imperceptibly as the wave of sound passed through to throb away into the night. Haldred made sure the curtain had fallen into place before she drew back the hood of her cloak. Her hand trembled slightly as she dropped it to her side, and her quickened heartbeat easily kept pace with the muffled frenzy downstairs. Not for the first time did she wonder what crazy and misplaced sense of adventure had brought her out this night. Such trysts were for fools or lovers, and she believed herself to be neither. Yet here she was, at the summons of a dangerous and possibly subversive undesirable, whom she had no real reason to trust, and many to dislike. Later she decided that it had been the odd encounter in the palace garden of Breck that had established some link. A measure of confidence had passed between them then, even a little understanding. And now, naive or not, she was convinced that of everyone she knew, this man alone would tell her the truth. Rune sat in silence, his legs stretched out in front of him. He had made no courtly motion when she had entered, not even risen to his feet. Still, an undertone in his gaze convinced her that he was at once relieved and pleased that she had come. It was an affirmation of the small trust, for he was not the only one at risk now. He nodded at a stool next to him.
What would Julos do if he discovered that I had met with a strange man in a place like this?
She spoke louder than she would have liked, to be heard above the din.
You will be amazed how much business is conducted in places like these.
She looked at him with raised brows.
No doubt.
In fact, I would not be surprised if he has beaten you to it and is sitting somewhere in the main hall, having an exceptional time.
It certainly sounds like his type of entertainment.
A heavy thud, as of a large table overturned, reverberated through the place. There was a fraction of a pause in the wailing music, as if the musicians had caught their breath, but the drums never missed a beat. She made a face at him as she sat down.
Could you not have picked a less rowdy place to meet?
He looked at her oddly.
Like the palace garden?
Their eyes met. Rune understood at once why he had grown to like this woman's company, why he could relax while trading light-hearted feints and thrusts, She had, honestly and foolishly, at their first meeting in distant Arius, extended trust towards him. Her fear and disquietude had made her vulnerable. It would have been easy to take advantage of such a situation had he had the inclination at the time. Yet there had been little on his mind except the furious insult passed down from Nuria. Later, that night in the garden, she had reinforced that frail trust by virtually taking sides with him against the powerful, charming Nurians, not to mention her husband. It was strange how disarming such blind, childlike confidence could be.
Tell me, Princess, why a woman of your youth and charm would be so eager to search out silence and solitude?
Oh, you may flatter all you like. It matters not to me. I am tired of lies and the selfish manipulations of men.
Women do not manipulate?
And women.
She fought down the annoyance of this typical interruption.
Recently, I have dreamed of being a simple country girl, far from the bright power of Arius, who may enjoy the love of her husband and child without fear of another's appetite or plotting.
As if in corroboration of her words, her aspect softened into a dreamlike state, her eyes staring away beyond the dingy little room.
You will not fight for what is yours?
I have fought, and lost.
Her eyes focused on him again.
No, I will admit that I did not fight very hard. It was never part of my dream.
He twisted his mouth in a wry smile.
What was?
Love?
She looked at him with large, sad eyes, and seemed at once little more than the foolish girl who had lived on such grand illusions. Rune shook his head slowly. Woman. There was an indignant pause on Haldred's part. She straightened her shoulders.
And your dream?
He leaned forward, incredulous at his own frank honesty with this near stranger. He uttered the single word with exaggerated pleasure, as if the mere sound of it could be a source of complete satisfaction. Vengeance. Haldred regarded him closely.
It could not have been your first dream.
No, my first foolish dream died a slow, cold death, and I no longer mourn its passing.
There was an awkward pause. The noise from the drinking hall, which had somehow grown distant, welled up again, filling the void. As if the strange music reminded her of the reason for their meeting, Haldred shook free of the morbid atmosphere that had settled about them.
Tell me of the South.
Rune shrugged, his brow furrowed with concentration.
It is a nest of evil, as you may have suspected. I can confirm that, though I know not of a place that is free from it. The slaves are treated better elsewhere, perhaps. The air is cleaner, and the rituals do not involve the slaying of humans, and the bones thrown to the dogs may be exclusively those of animals. But evil thrives everywhere. Mayhap it is simply more refined in the gilded halls of the northern kings, where the priests and scholars have coated it in sophistication and purple velvet.
His voice had turned low and bitter.
You saw no sign of treason, of a coming swarm?
Rune stared at the young woman, who suddenly seemed to plead with him for protection and security. She was a child, frightened and vulnerable, and was willing to put all her fragile confidence in him. The small door opened in his mind to let him gaze on forgotten sentiments. When he spoke at last, it was words he did not entirely believe.
I would not stay in Brek. I would find the strongest walled city in Ligerium, or even better, I would remove myself out of harm's way, travel to the Isles.
She laughed nervously.
What would a Ligerian princess do in Trex Isles? Be reduced to the concubine of some pirate lord?
Concubine?
He frowned deeply.
One such as you would be taken to wife, and they are not all as undesirable as reputation insists.
The smile had faded from her lips.
I am married.
You say that with regret?
She glanced down at her clenched hands, feeling extremely young and silly. Her reply was barely audible.
I do.
You want him dead? It can be arranged quite easily.
She had no need of feigning to portray her shock and dismay.
No! I'm not the type who can murder her husband in the morning and embrace the perpetrator of the crime at noon. Julos was my choice. I have to live with it.
Rune's words were slow and deliberate.
There is not a person in all of Myril who deserves such dedication.
Her reply was laced with hopelessness.
Are all relationships merely for convenience? Would you not expect such loyalty from a spouse?
Once I might have, and been fool enough to, but no more. I have seen my share of base humanity, and for me, there is only one foundation: mutual benefit. Beyond that, there is only exploitation."
He waved an impatient hand.
"But such discussion is futile. Harbor your illusions if they bring you comfort."
He rose to his feet. Suddenly the words of Karth echoed in his ears again. The blow will fall at the darkening of this very cycle. He spoke with a force of command, as if there were no longer any uncertainties.
"Take your child to the Isles, or to the east. Do not remain here, or attempt to hide in Ligurium. If you do, you will be right in the thick of it."
A last solemn look passed between them before he stepped through the curtain. Haldred watched the folds falling into place behind him. She would linger for a while, with her jumble of thoughts for company. They had agreed to travel separately. In case either of them was recognized, they would not be seen together. Maris waited downstairs to escort her home. Yet she felt deserted and exposed, now that the strange Nurian had gone, and there was no promise of a future meeting. Somehow his overconfidence and audacity exuded an aura of security, as if one merely had to be in his proximity to be safe. However, she would not be given an opportunity for such fanciful hopes. She would have to face her fate alone. The second 10th day in the season of hunting was celebrated throughout the northern kingdoms as the feast day of Imran. After the god of battle's mythical triumph over the Dark One on the first day of Hysuntide, 50 days of feasting and celebration ensued, or would ensue, depending on which doctrinal stand one had taken, culminating in the Feast of Imran. Though fully 2/3 of the followers of Imran believed his victory to be a future event, the more radical and adamant believed that it had, in fact, already taken place. Between these extremes were several other opinions, not least of which expounded that the cyclic observance of this day no longer had any relevance in the present age. Despite the small differences in observing the feasts, the potentates of every realm had agreed early on to scale down the extent of the festivities, since no kingdom could afford its citizens to revel or even just laze about for such an extended period of time every cycle. The 50 days had shrunk to a season, and then a 10-day, and finally, to accommodate both the beginning and the ending, 2 days only. The Hysuntide feast on the first day, and Imran's feast on the last. Whereas the former had religious overtones, the latter was traditionally a time of debauchery and excess, and therefore the more ardently supported of the two. For all its color and invitation to exuberance, the feast day of Imran dawned in dull gray tones over the countryside of Ligurium. Suntide was failing fast, and what had promised to be a season of adventure and victory had only yielded a dismal conquest of Lysan and a multiplying of domestic troubles. The most immediate concern was a severe grain shortage in the primary towns, even while the harvest promised to be a good one, and was ripening on the lands. In Arius, all but 2 of the bakeries had already closed. As a result, other foodstuffs had become dramatically expensive in the markets. The day of festival was permeated with the threat of rioting. Though this need required urgent attention from the authorities, a rising tide of calamity had faded such concerns into insignificance. News from Lysan, and even the south of Ligurium, was consistently bad. The deprivations caused by raiders based in the Tristwood, though supposedly suppressed by the successful campaign in Lysan, had flared up again with an unprecedented intensity a 10-day before. Villages deep inside Ligurium had been attacked, though the governor in Nicoma had called for aid and reinforcements. Normally this threat could have been dealt with in force, but with the collapse of morale among the fighting men of Ligurium, there was little to do but defend the realm with untrained militia. The Ligurian king and his advisors spent a very subdued feast day behind closed doors. Tregoran had summoned to him all the men he believed he could still trust in a last-ditch effort to save his kingship. There had been demands already that he step down in favor of a more decisive and aggressive successor. He glanced at each of the 5 men in turn, his expression that of a man who had no more counsel for himself. His gaze finally lighted on his nephew, Zurich, who alone had not an air of bewilderment about him. At once, a little hope was kindled in him also, lending him enough resolve to cast even more bad tidings into the cauldron of ill humor. He studied their reactions as he announced the breakout of whaling plague among the people of Gades and Deraco. Not unexpectedly, he could read there the same horror and fear that he had felt at first. Gades was fewer than 50 miles from Arius itself. One by one the men dropped their heads. Only Zurich did not fail to meet his eye. Here was the only unbroken arrow in all of Ligurium. To this man the king addressed himself.
What curse is it that rests upon us this cycle?
Zurich spoke with resolution, drawing the gaze of all the men to him.
No curse, your highness, but a severe test of the kingship.
Tregoran smiled wryly.
It was not the king who pressed for the invasion of Lysan, but his advisers.
The conquest of Lysan had become a necessity, even as now the pacification of it has.
Terian of Estium spoke up at last.
We share your views, Count, but we had an army for the conquest of Lysan. At present we have little more than an armed rabble.
And still, we have little idea of the true strength of these raiders. Can it be that they are merely dissidents from Lysan?
This came from an elderly man in military attire. His face was weathered and wrinkled, his beard streaked with gray. Tregoran looked at him sharply, then posed the questions on all their minds.
The king has been executed. What are these men fighting for? Who are they?
The older man frowned heavily.
The campaign was dogged with ill luck and misfortune from the start. I have never seen the like of it, and the opposition unbelievably strong.
He looked up from staring at his knuckles.
Is it possible that we have been enticed into attacking Lysan?
Sirs,
Zurich forced a little smile.
I am afraid that our musings on the subject will yield no profit, and only whittle away the time we have to plan our response.
He shifted in his seat.
Allow me to make a suggestion or two. I have little doubt that the men of Ligurium are prepared to defend their homes against raiders, but they will not follow the type of leadership that helped bring about the disaster in the Tristwood. A strong man will lead them to victory, a weak one only to catastrophe. Put an able general over the soldiers to rally them. The Tristwood must be cleared of raiders. Waiting for them to strike further demoralizes the people. I suggest we recall the men from Lysan to assist in this task.
There was a gasp of dismay.
Abandon Lysan?
That is defeatist talk.
Zurich raised a hand.
Do not misunderstand me. The Nurian force may hold Breck on our behalf, but we need our soldiers there to cut off the retreat of these dissidents. We will catch them neatly between the hammer and the anvil.
An appraising silence met these words. Tregoran slowly nodded his head.
You will do this for your uncle and the kingdom?
Zurich kept all signs of satisfaction from his face.
Of course I will, your majesty.
What of the men garrisoned in Breck? Will they march out?
If marching out means eventually marching home, I believe they will.
Energy seemed to spread throughout the realm at the accession of Zurich as supreme commander. It was almost embarrassing how quickly the men rallied and reaffirmed their oaths. If anything, the reign of Tregoran was cast in an even more dismal light. So swift was the turnaround in morale that several rumors started around it, not the least of which claimed that a fortune in gold had been shipped from the estates of the affluent count to the primary concentrations of soldiers in Ligurium. Even more miraculous than this was the speedy cessation of raids across Vindar's line. Within a 10-day and a half, these deprivations and acts of brutality had become a memory, and Zurich was hailed as the champion of Ligurium. There were soldiers everywhere, clearing away burnt homesteads, delivering much-needed supplies, patrolling the borderlands and fringes of the Tristwood. News spread that the men from Breck were coming home, and that the thieves and robbers of Lysan would soon be trapped and brought to justice. The hungry population had found hope and a hero. Julos greeted the tidings from Ligurium with jubilation. The prospect of a campaign to the north did not really appeal to him, but he was ecstatic at the thought of being released from the prison of Breck and its famine for good wine and entertainment. Already he could hear the sympathetic purring of his female admirers in Arus as he regaled them with accounts of his long deprivation in the borderlands. The banishment to Lysan would now bear delicious fruit for him, for such an experience would put his rivals in the shadow for quite a while. He pretended just enough annoyance with Haldred for her refusal to accompany him, and her insistence on returning to Amorous instead. If she wanted to go back to hiding in the country, he would not stand in her way. In fact, the safe passage of his wife and son provided him with an admirable excuse for sending the garrison of Breck westward, while he traveled on the northern road with his bodyguard. He secretly intended to involve himself as little as possible in the actual campaign, and the pressing business of seeing his family safely over the border to Nicoma would be used to his advantage. There would be enough time to rejoin the garrison and claim whatever victory they had achieved as his own. Even so, he gave the orders for departure a full 2 days late. Let the forces under Teoric clear the woods. Was that not their agreed task? His men were to cut off enemies fleeing southward, and certainly there would be none for several days at least. Why should he do the dirty work? There would be glory enough when he paraded his captives through the streets of Arus. Honor and acclaim were very much linked to good timing. Within 3 days he would turn westward to join his men and reap his share of it. There was surprisingly little resistance from the renegades in the Tristwood. For the most part, they seemed to have no stomach for fighting in pitched battles against the hardened soldiers of Ligurium. A skirmish here and there was enough to put them to flight, and recovery was made of livestock and loot, to be returned to the stricken towns and villages along the border. A 10-day of action cleared the forest of enemies. More than 24 hideouts were destroyed, and though the captives were few, Teoric assured the king of enemy losses in excess of 250 men. It was a victory to equal the capture of Breck. A single shadow was cast by a report from the Ligurian captain in Lysan. While the soldiers had captured only half a dozen fleeing rebels, and the country seemed truly subdued at last, Governor Julos had strangely failed to join his men after setting out with his family. Search parties had not been able to locate a trace of him or his guards as yet. It seemed hardly credible that he had accompanied his wife to Amorous, yet there was no other plausible explanation. There was only one part of the interviews with Karth that Rune felt he could control, the end. Several hours before he had to meet with the odd man, he was already on edge, for the sorcerer had a most disconcerting way of unnerving him. The discomfort spread from his mind almost like a disease, till his body protested with sweaty palms and tingling spine. On occasion, he could feel the hairs rise on the nape of his neck, and every sinew in his frame seemed to tense. Far from intimidating him into respect or subservience, these sensations served to foul his temper and put him in a fighting mood. He would give the man no indication of his unease. Then, in parting, he found again the icy calm of the arena, the clarity of thought and motive that had somehow eluded him during the conversation. Only then was he sure that this man could never make him act outside his own volition. Anticipating this regaining of control aided him in stumbling through the pressures, subtle and forceful, which threatened to compel every last secret thought from his mind and have him spill it out in simple-minded trust. He could not be pushed to this point of subservience, for he was aware that Karth needed him. For some mysterious reason, the master of Heron Inrath could not afford an attempt to break his will, but rather played for his loyalty and devotion, a voluntary surrender of his spirit. Knowing this strengthened his ability to resist. Karth listened patiently throughout the lengthy report. Here and there, he nearly nodded his head as if Rune's experience confirmed what he had suspected. Towards the end, he became distracted, and to the puzzlement of the younger man, hardly seemed to listen.
Why exactly did you send me to Lakeside? Certainly not to barter a trade agreement with Malik.
The old man looked at him in an odd way.
I needed you as a point of contact. It is nigh impossible to probe the mists round Terrallan without such, and you have a strong spirit, with much of the power of your ancestors. In the dark field of Myril, you stand out as a bright beacon.
There it was again, the tingling of countless nerves. In some incomprehensible way, he had served as a lodestone for the old man's magic.
You used me for your sorceries.
Rune's voice was blunt.
It was a test, merely, and to confirm a certain suspicion.
No one uses me.
If you are out to misunderstand me, then yes, I used you. But consider this. An untried bowstring is not worthy of trust.
And I am merely a bowstring to you.
There are many thousands who will never have that privilege.
Rune turned up one corner of his mouth in what resembled a grimace.
Keep your secrets, but take care. I will hold you to your promises.
Karth slowly shook his head.
Yes, your thirst for vengeance, to make Fengor suffer for the injury done to you. Are you incapable of seeing beyond such a shallow triumph?
What is it that I should see? Your cause? I care nothing for the fate of the cattle around the inland sea.
Despite himself, Rune's face had taken on a little color, and his hands were shaking on the carved wood of the armrests. The old man leaned forward and spoke in low tones.
A man enshrouded in hate and bitterness is a mere shadow. His touch is only ever cold and destructive. The dark he lurks in fills his thoughts and his soul, till he becomes its faithful exponent. If he ever reaches the moment of vengeance he longed for so ardently, he will probably expire at that time, since all his life had shrunk to the single purpose now achieved.
And what would you know of such emotions?
I know more than you can dream, for I have spent many lifetimes on the road you travel now. I've grown old and weak with it. My spirit is withered, my flesh frail. You can gain nothing from this relentless pursuit. Think hard and deep on what was stolen from you. Can you measure it in terms of material value? Will it be paid for with one simple act of vengeance?
Rune clenched his hands into fists.
Do not presume to tell me what I should feel. You are a manipulator of men.
Karth did not seem to hear him.
It was not only happiness of which you were deprived. To be happy is a simple choice, a state of mind. A fool may be happy in his ignorance.
There was a gleam in his eyes now, as if his words were born from the clarity of deep thought.
You were robbed of purpose. Every dream is shallow now, all power vain, all riches dust, and all love-based selfishness. You were cut off from your destiny, and the only motive left is anger.
What of it?
Rune was on his feet.
I will exact my payment from him, and from all others who happen to come in my way.
He strode to the doorway, unreasonable rage contorting his face. He would hear no more of these twisting words, would not allow his resolve to be diverted from its single purpose. Karth was wrong, had to be wrong, for it was impossible to think, or live, or feel, until the past had been obliterated, and his demons banished back to the pit. There was no forceful word to challenge his parting statement. Instead, the old man looked at him in a sympathetic way.
You are tired, no doubt. Your journey has been a long and fruitful one. I am in your debt.
He rose slowly.
Take some rest before we speak again. There are important tasks waiting for you.
The summons from Karth did not come the next day or the day after. At first, Rune was fretting to be away again, free from the pressures and unsettling observations of his eerie employer. But by the second sunrise, he awoke from dreamless sleep, stretched out his limbs, and reveled in the quiet of his room. The thick stone walls and heavy door kept the bustle of early rising kitchen workers out. Even the songs of birds were distant echoes of the waking world. He wondered for a moment at this unexpected peace. He had no immediate concerns, other than to find his way to the dining hall to break his fast. There was no kingdom to rule, not even a small island one, no plan to devise, no enemies to outwit. He did not even have to bargain for a better price in the markets round the sea. Someone else was plotting and scheming, pacing late at night with secret strategies and unfinished machinations. He sighed and rolled over, savoring the silence in his mind. Hannik joined him in the dining hall for a leisurely morning meal. The tall Viron was bursting with curiosity about the marshlands, and asked many a probing question. Rune could not help smiling to himself as they conversed in low tones, for it was soon apparent that the other envied him his recent travels and experiences. He conjured an image of the dark threat beneath Lakeside, and wondered how well his enthusiastic comrade would have fared under the nose of Malik Julian. Having no clear instruction as to how to spend his time, Rune avoided the fencing hall for once, to wander off into the countryside. Hunting would soon give way to reapage, and the fields, orchards, and vineyards of this small island realm lay heavy with ripened red and gold. The air moved slowly, carrying suggestions of mellowness everywhere. Sickles were sharp, and ready for gathering the bounty of the harvest. It did not seem strange that he could feel such respite in this atmosphere. The threat of war and violence belonged to another world, as if the barrier of the Witch Sea had sealed off this little island from the rest of Myrol. And yet the old stone battlements of fir served as a not-so-subtle reminder that the present harmony could not last. There had been strife here in the distant past, and there would be again. Here and there were farming hamlets, inhabited by the original settlers of Erin Inrath. They resembled the people of the West March of Arran, though smaller-boned and not as tall, and for all their isolation seemed friendly enough. There were smiles and greetings as he passed through their cobbled streets, and a group of young children waved a shy farewell when he stepped into the lane beyond their homes. No doubt they had seen many similar strangers during their short lives, and had been told that these men were here for their protection. Rune knew that this was quite true, for the fertile island would most certainly have been subjected by some ruthless track islander had it not been for Karth. He entered a small wooded dell, where the sun-tide brightness waxed soft and diffident among the tall shadows. The rushing of a stream drowned all other sounds, growing ever louder as he picked his way among moss-speckled stones down towards it. The soil was almost black here, soft and rich, a bedding ground for tall ferns and reedy grass. The last few steps of the steep descent he had to take with care, and then the cavern of wooded green swallowed him completely in a dim, cool embrace. The smell of earth was almost tangible, damp and sweet with decayed vegetation. He sat down on a cold rock, watching the busy water. Rune stretched out his legs and sighed. The dance of the 1,000 droplets and the cascading water was mesmerizing. He stared till he forgot the time and the place, and the weight of who he was. How long he sat he could not tell, but all too soon the spell was broken, and his gaze shifted to the tops of his boots. He became aware of the subtle weight of the blade at his side, and the discomfort of his stony seat. At once he heard the heavy footfall of a man scrambling down the same way he had come. He was on his feet, instinctively placing his right hand on the clasp of his belt, and shifting his weight to the right leg, his left hip with the sheath thrust slightly forward. The sudden movement, though hardly threatening, had shattered the mood of tranquility. He gave no thought to or felt no regret at its departure. Hannik stepped into the shady sanctuary, momentarily obscuring the blaze of afternoon sunlight and deepening the semi-darkness of the interior. He registered but little surprise at finding Rune there, and merely nodded his head by way of greeting.
Here you are, then.
You are looking for me.
Hannik did not reply, but stooped down on one knee to drink from the stream. He rose up, sighed deeply, and drew a sleeve across his mouth.
I am. You leave tomorrow, and we have some preparations to make.
Where to this time?
A devious smile spread across the other's face. Rune could swear what he said next gave him extreme pleasure.
You are on your merry way to Nuria.
Nuria?
You will travel as a trader, well disguised, and carry dispatches to Gilreth, to a certain man there.
I just happen to be exiled
The
from...
beard will have to go, and of course, we will have to darken your skin a little.
Hannik looked at him quizzically.
And replace my eyes with those of a fish?
There was a quick smile in reply.
Something like that.
Rune was surprised at how little the familiar landscape of Eastern Nuria affected him. Perhaps the knowledge that it was forever beyond his reach had reinforced his resolve not to allow repressed sentiments to cause him additional discomfort. It was difficult enough with the painful disguise he was forced to endure. By far the worst were the molded and polished fish scales that had transformed his eyes into those of non-Nurian origin. Almost completely transparent, they nonetheless obscured his vision sufficiently to cause frustration, and wearing them all the day long brought irritation and pain well before nightfall. At times he had to clench his fists, not to tear them out and grind them to dust, a plague on the alchemists of Heron Inrath. The loose garments of a Phesian merchant, combined with a light hooded cape and the darkened skin, had altered his appearance adequately for him not to fear being recognized even by those who knew him well. Yet he was never at ease, for discovery would mean death. A certain disquiet had also gripped him after passing through Store, and though he had tried to reassure himself that it had been caused by the struggle to control his feelings, there was no shaking it off. On the morning of the second day out of Store, one of his drivers warned him that they were being followed. There were many travelers on the road to Belruth, but few of them moved as slowly as the heavy ox carts in his train. 3 men, almost certainly from the Fez themselves, had caught up with the caravan before they had crossed the River Ain into Nuria 3 days before, and were keeping pace with them some way to their rear. There was no apparent reason for their tardiness, other than to stay close to what they perceived to be a fellow countryman. Even so, they had made no effort to approach the column. Once he had noticed them, Rune could think of nothing else. Who were they? Malik's men? That was hardly likely. Could they be Fengor's? No, he would not wait for his hated brother to cross into Nuria before accosting him. Unless he wanted to discover Rune's contact in Gilreth. They could even be Karth's spies, keeping an eye on the reckless and unreliable Nurian. Why had Karth sent him on this mission? Would it not have been much easier to trust Hunnick with it? He, at least, could come and go as he pleased in Nuria. Or could he? Not for the first time, Rune fretted at how little he knew of these men of Heron Inrath. Karth could very well have sent him on the previous missions, only to gain his trust, and now he was unknowingly on his way to some sinister end in Gilreth. He longed for the familiar touch of the blade on his left thigh, the steel sword that he was forced to wear in case of need, though a fine weapon, offered but a feeble comfort to his troubled thoughts. When surrounded by enemies, and being unsure of their intentions, he had only ever had one trusted ally, and this he had had to conceal under the bed of the lead cart of the convoy. As Hunnick and the like trust in steel, he knew what set him apart from other men. The eastern road branched off the main highway 32 miles short of Belruth. It passed through Tew, 20 miles distant, and just beyond it forked in a northeasterly and southerly direction. The southern road led to Monostor and the wheat-yielding plains. The other led to the cattle country around Gilreth. Tew was a mill town that had prospered into a sprawling community of small artisans and leather workers. There were no walls or defenses of any kind, for the heartland of Nuria had not seen war for many generations. Nor was there a garrison larger than the dozen guards needed for local enforcement of the law. Rune had his teamsters hurry the caravan through the town. He preferred camping at the forking of the road to the east of Tew to running the risk of being discovered by the curious folk so close to his place of birth. Furthermore, he would have to find a place of seclusion this night. The scales had become an irritation beyond endurance. He would have to remove them, at least for a day or two. The flaps of his tent had hardly closed behind him when he pried out the slippery little discs with trembling fingers. He lay back and rinsed his eyes with water, sighing softly at the sudden absence of pain. Pressing his elbow over his temples, he relaxed completely. There was a stir outside his tent, the nervous clearing of a throat. Sabar, his lead teamster, spoke in Phesian through the opening between the secured flaps.
Master, may I present to you the respected Haman Utsora, our countryman, wishing to make your acquaintance.
Rune sat up in consternation. Of course, the wretched travelers who had tailed him so long had to choose this moment to make a burden of themselves. He knew enough of the Thesian language to haggle over the prices of merchandise, but was in doubt whether this knowledge would stand up to the scrutiny of a cultured native. Neither would his red-rimmed eyes, now bereft of their mask.
A moment, Savar. I'm not well.
He could not douse the light without arousing suspicion. For an instant he contemplated merely sending them away, but his curiosity had now been pricked. Would these men put themselves at his mercy if they suspected him? Could it be that they were innocent travelers after all? What would be their business in faraway Gilreth? He moved the lamp behind his folded bedding, till his face and upper body were cast in deep shadow, while the visitors would have to look into the full brightness of it. He squatted down cross-legged in the manner of the Thesians, folded his hands in his lap, so that they were covered by the long sleeves of his robe, and addressed Savar in a barely audible voice.
Bring them in.
The teamster reached to undo the fastening of the flaps and peered in tentatively. Then he held back the canvas and announced the Thesian in a rather loud and formal voice. The man inclined his head respectfully and pronounced the customary blessing as he entered. Rune waited for Savar to introduce him before nodding in turn. As the man seated himself and squinted into the lamplight, Rune had to refrain from smiling. He hastily sent the teamster off for wine. The man was alone and nervous. Rune wondered for a moment whether his companions were already in the camp, and then whether this was indeed one of the men who had seemed to be following them. He spoke quickly, as a native would, not allowing precise pronunciation of words to give him away.
What news of the south, good sir?
The man peered at him, obviously trying to get a better look at his obscured features.
You have been south recently, Marish.
I hardly travel beyond the cities of Arius and Amrys these days. Most of my trade originates from the Isles.
He was sure the word he had used had not been quite correct, but the other seemed not to notice.
I am a trader myself, but I hardly travel with such heavy-laden carts.
He laughed as if Rune was supposed to share his secret.
No. My wares will never even fill one of your crates.
He leaned forward conspiratorially.
I trade in precious stones, you see, rare and costly, for the palates of the royals. Would you be interested in a specimen?
Rune understood the man's nervousness instantly, and also why he and his companions had not joined themselves to the caravan immediately. A trader in jewelry stones had to be on guard against robbers at all times. Something puzzled him, though.
You are traveling to Gilreth. Why not visit Belruth first? You are sure to find a better market here.
The merchant looked at him quizzically.
With respect, sir, you lack the understanding and insight that my trade requires. The smiths of Gilreth are far less likely to gauge the value of my stones correctly, being so isolated. I am well able to double my profits there.
A conspiratorial half-smile spread over his face. His eyes gleamed in the stark light.
You traveled from Joel?
Rune thought it best to keep asking the questions.
That is so.
A frown quickly replaced the smug expression.
It is no easy trip in these troubled times.
He dropped his head a little so that the whites of his eyes showed when he glanced at Rune.
There are dark whispers in the south, Marish. The markets are strangely empty. Buyers from the marshlands place huge orders and collect them before the goods can compete for a better price. The slave trade is at a standstill.
He lowered his voice.
There is fear everywhere, since the Ligerians murdered Borgrest.
Murdered? Did he not get what he deserved?
Haman's eyes grew wide with shock.
He was the sovereign of his own country. What right did the Lekwits have to dethrone and butcher him?
Rune realized his mistake too late. Of course the Thesians would hold a vastly different viewpoint to that of the Northerners. To them, Borgrest had been a sympathetic neighbor, if not a friend. The Ligerian aggression had sent shockwaves of misgiving through the southern realms. He made an attempt to recover the situation.
No right, of course. I meant that the king had miscalculated badly and had to pay the price for it. How did you put it? He lacked the understanding and insight that his trade required.
Haman guffawed loudly and slapped his knee.
Ah, that is well put indeed, even if I have said so.
The flaps parted, spilling the fragrant night air into the tent. Sabar bowed his way in with 2 goblets and a skin of wine from their best stock. The merchant proved even more talkative after he had had a good sampling of wine. They discovered a mutual acquaintance in Hussar of Breck, whose excellent reputation and health they toasted several times. After Rune casually agreed to his request for traveling together, Haman warmed even more, and insisted on toasting the health and prosperity of his host no less than 5 times. Rune wondered whether the quality of the wine had anything to do with this display of geniality, but secretly encouraged the excesses of the trader in the hope of loosening his tongue completely. This proved of little value, however, since the man seemed to shear away from the rumors of the south like a sore tooth. Rune had seen enough of fear to know that Haman Utsora was mortally afraid of what force might lurk behind the sinister changes he had witnessed. The caravan wound its painfully slow way to Gilreth, and for 14 more days Rune plied the Ephesians with questions. By the time they were ready to part company on the threshold of the Nurian city, he had learnt little more than he had deduced during that first night of introduction. It was certain, however, that the Fez was not actively involved in, or even supportive of, the raiding activities in Ligurium. That the traders and their countrymen were deeply suspicious of the Ligurians and their Nurian allies was also apparent. They regarded Trigaran as a weakling, but feared Fingor of Nuria like the plague. He it was, they believed, who had planned the takeover of Lysan. After all, did the Nurians not still keep a strong garrison in Breck? Trigaran was but a willing dupe in the hands of his ally. It was with a measure of relief that Rune bade them fortune and prosperity with their travels and transactions. He was quite certain that they were nobody's spies, while the wine and their talkative nature had kept his disguise impregnable. Yet he was grateful for the diversion, for it had occupied his silent, brooding evenings, and not allowed his mind to stray now that he was confronted again by the familiar landscape of his former home. Gilreth boasted but a single wall, an arched gatehouse, and 4 turrets as its shield against direct attack. The wall was not as high or strong as that of Belruth, but it circumvented the entire city, making it at least twice as long. Count Pyran's forebears had kept the place in fighting trim for many long cycles, though it had not seen a siege in modern history. No homes or structures were permitted outside the wall for at least a mile. The little hamlets and farmsteads in the vicinity were built entirely of wood, so as not to allow an enemy besieger easy access to stone for his siege weapons. The forest had been cleared back for many miles, so that Gilreth stood alone and proud on the brow of its low hilltop. In the distant past, before the tumult and confusion of the summoning and cleansing, this realm had been the most fiercely independent of the 5 Viron cities. It had had little aid from the others in subduing the land, and most of its battles were fought under its own banners by reason of its isolation. Though the other 3, Stor, Gerdel, and Ingerval, had soon diminished under the power and influence of Belruth and the king, Gilreth alone had retained a measure of its ancient identity and autonomy. Even the scourging of the questors had not been able to destroy the hold of the old count over his lands, though they had stripped the place of its symbols and history. Still, the proud mystery of the distant past lingered here. Every child in Gilreth knew that the green air on Sable had not been its original insignia, but the 5 stars of the blade, with the North Star at its tip, that the council had renamed as Gith, the Eye of the Dragon. Small wonder, thought Rune bitterly, that everyone had set such store by the union of his brother with a daughter of Byrand. Would it not have tied the 2 cities closer together? But now Byrand's daughter was gone, though she had left Fingor a son with a distant claim on the realm of Gilreth. His brother could not have planned it better. It was clear that Gilreth had grown more inwardly than otherwise during the cycles of his exile. It seemed somehow smaller than he remembered, darker, and more suspicious of strangers. His strain received many a curious and guarded stare from the city folk, till it was almost a relief to arrive at the mostly deserted merchant's quarter. It was late enough in the day not to proceed to the square and commence the weary business of trading. What deliveries of wine and spices that had to be made to the alehouses and taverns could also wait till morning. He had his men care for and stable the animals, while he sauntered over to the bathhouse. There were no attendants, to his annoyance, and no fires for heating water. With a sigh, he turned to summon one of the teamsters to see to it, reminding himself, not for the first time, that he would have to employ a body servant or slave soon. The rough living of an adventurer was no longer to his taste. It was his own deep-rooted suspicion and distrust that had prohibited the acquisition of such a one in the past, and it would seem to be no simple task, what with the prospects of trade as dismal as it had become. For a moment he could see the sorry shapes of the slaves in the bowels of Lakeside. He shuddered at the thought of allowing one of those in his close proximity for any length of time. It appeared that he would have to keep his tryst with Carth's man while still weary and begrimed by travelling. This was certainly not how he conducted his affairs, and he smiled to himself at how royal he had remained through the passage of time. At a whim, he decided to turn the agreed interview on its head. He would let the contact meet him instead, at a time and place suited to his needs. He watched the fire licking hungrily at the dry wood, and slowly caressing the rounded iron of the urn. He felt pleased with himself and his cleverness. Perhaps he was going to enjoy this whisper-in-the-dark affair more than he had anticipated. He dispatched Sabar to the tavern, having briefed him with care as to how the contact would respond to his coded greeting, and what message he would have to deliver to the man. The teamster trembled at such responsibility, and hurried off like a first-time errand boy. He was little more than that, Rune thought, as he slipped into the luxury of the scented, warm water. Carth had few Phaesians among his hodgepodge of followers, and he had to have scraped the bottom of the barrel with a pack accompanying Rune. The sky was clear and cloudless. No night fog, so common in these far northern climes, had descended to obscure the stars. The bright, fiery jewels lay flung out in their ageless patterns across the firmament, and Rune wondered how Haman Utsora could ever hope to compare his grimy stones with such finery. The fabled swan of Hylart, queen of frost and snow, floated dreamily above the eastern horizon. Her appearance marked the beginning of leaf-fall. In her chest burned brightly still the stone of suntide she had swallowed. He glanced at the familiar pattern of the dragon's head, or the anchor as it was known in the islands. Here it could be little else but the blade, and that is how he preferred to see it, as if in commemoration of the bond between him and the weapon, whose cold weight he had concealed under his cloak. What would be the hilt of the starry sword, pointed away to the southwest, as good an indicator of the time as the finest clocks of store. It was close to midnight. The third watch was about to commence. His contact should arrive soon. The hunting shed he had selected for a meeting place slumped among the few low trees in a shrubby gorge about 1.5 miles northwest of Gilreth. He had been surprised to find it still standing, and almost regretted his choice, as achingly clear memories played around him. The stream still wound its way among the lichen-speckled stones, to disappear in a hiss over the edge of a miniature waterfall. Down to the pool of his childhood, it spattered in 1,000 droplets silvered in the starlight, though the rains of grey cast were still 2 seasons distant, and the suntide had been hot and scorching. The dank smell of shady, moist decay, aided by the cool night air, here pushed back stronger perfumes of dried, suntide grasses and flowers. Time had stopped for the abandoned husk of a cottage, for the swirling water and lilting trees. Quickly, he would banish the flow of bright recollections from his thoughts. The feel of cold stone beneath his bare feet before the loud yell and leap into the pool, the vying with Gary, to touch the distant bottom first and bring up a stone as proof. Tunnels of mystery and adventure to explore in the undergrowth. Later, the sparkle of sunlight on their blades as they fenced and wrestled for supremacy. And then the single dazzling memory, a blue-eyed look from Gary's tag-along sister, 2 cycles their junior, who had suddenly grown into a young woman. How the smell of her, the touch of her, lingered in this place. Rune gripped the stone sill of a gaping window in his one hand, raising the other to his temples. This is all he had of her, here, among the ruins, as in Belruth, secret trysts and stolen kisses. He had wanted nothing else in all of Myrol, no battles to fight, no kingdoms to rule, until he had won her heart. But there had been no need for conquest. Her shy smile had been for him alone. Her fingers had slipped into no other hand. How his mind had drifted to her, even during training like a besotted lover. She had been more than that. A friend who had shared his confidences, who had laughed at his poor pleasantries. A woman who had promised herself to him for life. He paced away from the starlight, away from the turmoil in his mind. It had been here, among the pale ferns, that they had set their union day, and sealed their destiny in an embrace of passion. She would never belong to another man. Only after had come the lies, even the falsehood of their sworn union, and the dark pit of his brother's spite had swallowed every speck of hope. She would play him false in the end. She had knowingly encouraged the pouring out of his soul, to twist free of him at the last, into Fengor's greedy, beguiling arms. How he hated that man! He would be satisfied with his complete destruction, if he did no other thing with his life. For a moment he trembled with the intensity of his anger, as if his frame was not large enough to contain it. A single noise brought him to his senses. Footsteps were coming down the path, by the sound of it, more than one person. He frowned in the dark, loosening the blade in its sheath. It had not been mentioned that there would be more than one man. Closer they crept, carefully now, till he could hear their breathing. One slightly labored, a man no longer in the prime of his life. The other barely audible, a vigorous fellow. He drew himself into a corner. 2 hooded men had stopped outside the window. The sudden sound of a voice, here among these walls, spoken with such loud indifference, in such familiar tones, made him draw his breath in a silent hiss of surprise.
Do you think he's here already?
It was the voice of Garilane, son of Count Byrand, brother to the haunting Aethera, erstwhile friend and comrade. Could he be the contact? Who then was the other man? Gary had addressed him as an equal. Somewhat broader and stockier than the figure who had spoken, the heavy breather shrugged and looked around him. Then he folded back his hood before speaking.
Small matter. We will wait.
Rune had almost anticipated the shock. It was the Count himself. So the contacts in Gilreth were none other than their ruler and his heir. He was impressed, if uncomfortable, with the discovery. Karth might be a madman, but he had powerful allies, even in Nuria itself. Though why the old man had neglected to tell him who he was to meet, he could only guess. He was quite certain that these 2 would be even more surprised in their turn to learn the identity of Lord Karth's messenger. He was glad to have removed the disguise that had so irritated him before coming. Not for a king's ransom would he hide his identity from them.
May Imran's choicest blessings rest upon the Lords of Gilreth.
He stepped into the light, drawing their gaze towards him. For a moment he was tempted to bow graciously, and with a sweeping arm like a Phesian, but his back proved a little too stiff for such acrobatics. Instead of responding in kind, the men stared at him mutely. Gary took a small step forward, as if to inspect the apparition at closer quarters, but his jerky movements betrayed his suspicions. Byrand had not moved, but his voice was uncertain.
Do we know you, sir?
Rune enjoyed their awkwardness more than would have been decent.
Most certainly. And then, most definitely not. You know me as I was, but cannot be acquainted with who I am.
Rune?
Gary had taken another step, and brought up a faltering hand as if to divine the identity of this stranger by touch. Rune recoiled in spite of himself, taking a step backwards. The physical contact with a former friend would somehow tear away at his frame. rob him of a large part of his freedom from shame.
Do not touch the accursed, Gary. It may rub off on you.
His jovial tone was edged with bitterness. Instantly he regretted the sting, for the young man's features had become contorted with anguish and grief. The outstretched hand joined his other in hiding his face, even as he turned away to hide his loss of control. Byrand had remained motionless throughout the little exchange, and it had given him time to deal with his astonishment. He spoke in a low voice, but steady.
You run a grave risk coming here.
As do you.
Rune smirked at the thought.
Or what do you think noble Fengor would say if he discovered the two of you rolling in the hay with Karth?
Byrand gasped in dismay.
Mind your tongue, you lout!
Forgive me, noble Count. I have had little in the way of refined company among the flotsam of the Isles.
Gary had turned round at these last words. There had been a sharp intake of breath from him too, which Rune had interpreted as shock at the rude remark. But now it was clear that he was shaking with laughter.
You need not fear discovery here. You'll find only friends in Gilreth.
The broad smile remained on his silvered features.
And stop pretending. I've never known you to be refined or respectful.
Rune felt his resentfulness ebb away. Somehow the familiar manner and speech of the friend of his youth had breached the enormity of 12 cycles of exile, fear, and embarrassment. Suddenly, he was glad that he did not have to deal with a stranger here. Dawn was fast approaching before Rune finally delivered Karth's message. The short watches of the night had slipped by in a painful revisiting of the past, those frightful events before and after the Truth Council that had robbed him of his identity. The men from Gilreth had pressed upon him that during those perplexing times the Nurians had not all accepted or believed the findings of the Council. Despite the shock of the second heir's death and the mysterious passing of the king soon after, men had spoken their opinions openly, and not all had been unfavorable. Though Rune had seen their desire for him to take heart at this, he had inwardly scorned their attempt, and instead found much to reaffirm his hatred. Now they had fallen silent, both staring at him in the fading starlight. He carefully spoke the words Karth had committed to his memory.
You are heading for serious confrontation with Belruth. The likelihood of civil strife increases by the 10-day. This must be prevented at all costs, at least till the darkening of the cycle. It is believed that the greater struggle will commence within this time, and all Viron will have to band together for survival.
Byrand stared at Rune, and Gary's frown deepened. Something in his friend's manner did not accord with the tidings he had brought. He spoke in concerned tones.
You do not believe this?
Rune shrugged.
Does it matter what I believe? I am the messenger, and do not traffic in politics.
It seems odd that Aaron Inrath would send a messenger such as you at such risk, and you are not even convinced of the truth of what you are saying?
Gary had tilted his head to one side.
Odd or no, I must press upon you both and need to wait till the darkening of this cycle before there can be any open and public defiance of Fengor's designs.
Byrand spoke at last.
What does Lord Karth mean by defiance?
Rune's reply was curt.
3 things. Arming and training every able-bodied man in Gilreth, opposing all attempts at escalating the war with Aaron, and finally a return to the abandoned and forbidden arts.
He smiled as if he had given them a generous gift.
What you are saying is treason and death.
How appropriate then, since I am a traitor and condemned to slow death.
He did not break the smile. Byrand was not amused.
Stop playing the martyr with me. I am well aware of your position. Too well.
Rune shrugged unconcernedly.
No doubt. Let me not bore you with the ramblings of the dispossessed.
He produced Karth's sealed letter from his pouch.
The details of your allies' plan are recorded in this correspondence.
He handed the letter to Byrand, who took it almost reluctantly, but broke the seal immediately. It seemed that he did not quite believe what he had been told, and needed to verify it without delay.
We are to return to the old ways.
Gary looked intently at his former friend.
Tell me, Rune, do you believe in this?
Rune shrugged.
Not necessarily, but I care nothing for Nuria or its laws. Break them if it pleases you, or if it is to your advantage.
There was a pensive silence.
Then why do you take the risk of discovery and punishment to bring us this message?
Rune looked away.
There were certain promises made to me, certain old scores, that have to be settled before I sleep in the foreign soil somewhere, and not with my father's.
The words were stark and desolate. Byrand raised questioning eyes from the letter.
The settling of those old scores undoubtedly includes your brother's head on a pike, or his body suspended by hooks from the castle wall.
There was little mirth in Rune's voice as he answered.
I will leave the likes of you to suspend the leftovers from the castle wall, if you can find any.
Rune spent the greater part of the day sleeping in his upstairs accommodation. Sabar had taken charge of the trading and delivery of goods, a task for which he displayed a modest talent. By the time his master rose yawning from his bed, the greater part of their business had been concluded. The caravan would stay another day or two to dispose of the remainder of unreserved merchandise in the open markets. Somewhat unexpectedly, Rune received 2 messages that afternoon, one on the heels of the other. They were from the Count and his son, respectively, both to meet with him in private. Byrand and Garelane were aware that he would not linger while the remaining goods were sold. He had expressed his aversion to the slow pace and conspicuousness of the train, as well as his desire to return at his own pace and alone. There was little reason to drag his feet out of danger. Nuria no longer drew him as strongly as of old. It was a surprise to receive individual invitations from these 2, though, and he smiled to think that they had things they would not speak in front of each other. So little had changed in the viper's nest. He had already agreed to meet with Gary before the Count's messenger had arrived. To avoid the one learning of the other's request, he set the meeting place with Byrand at a much later hour and a separate location. Of the 2, the latter would certainly be the more taxing and potentially dangerous. He did not quite trust these supposed allies, despite their warm words and manner. Gary was ill at ease during the first part of their interview. He was clearly uncomfortable with the setting, which was the same as their earlier meeting, and wore an expression of such misery that Rune almost regretted this deliberate ploy. Yet the latter was quick to reassure himself that this man's discomfort was nothing compared to the many cycles of torment he had endured. After what amounted to an inquiry into Rune's personal life since he had left Nuria, to which the exile responded with little more than monosyllables, Gary flung himself down with a sigh among the tall grass. His pathetic attempt at picking up the threads of an old life had crumbled round his ears. He rested his elbows on his knees and his chin in his cupped hands, staring down at the babbling water. His hopeless manner at last moved his boyhood friend to pity.
The man you knew is dead, Gary, and there are 100 reasons why you will never see him again.
Rune spoke as if trying to explain an obvious fact to a stubborn student. The seated man turned his head to look at him. A finger of sunlight played through his hair, which was but a shade darker than Aethera's had been.
I know all that. But I want to look past 100 and find just one to bring you back to life.
His blue eyes, exactly Aethera's, pleaded like those of a young child, an image that was shattered only by the hard lines already forming round his mouth. Rune felt suddenly compelled to look away.
She did not betray you.
What would you know of that?
You did not see what she suffered on your behalf.
On my behalf? That is a fine jest.
There was no grand scheme, no master plan by Fingor or anyone else. It just so happened that he wanted her, and was powerful and remorseless enough to take her.
Rune spat on the ground.
And soon I will be powerful and remorseless enough to take his life for that.
I do not take his part for a moment. What he did was monstrous and unforgivable. Aethera was my sister, Rune, and I loved her too. Still, I had to watch her being terrorized and cast into a whirlpool of confusion. She was a virtual prisoner in Belruth. It was only Talon's considerable influence that allowed her escape. Did you know that? She was not in Belruth when your betrothal was annulled, and only learned of it when she arrived here. She was shaken and distraught when they told her you had consented to it, though I do not think she believed it in the end. She refused to see anyone, even our father. She was afraid and alone.
Rune snorted in disgust, but this only served to encourage Gary.
Afraid, yes, and for you, for what Fingor might do to get his way. If you see that as a betrayal, well, You choose to do so.
A fine fabrication, Gary, but I've heard such tales before.
Believe what you want. All I ask is that you hear me out.
There was only a shrug in reply. Gary resumed, relieved at such a feeble resistance.
I failed her then. I admit it. For I did not support her. I had 22 cycles, like you, and my voice carried little authority. Father wanted the marriage, Fengor wanted it, Talon wanted it. How could she resist?
I would have taken her, far enough for them not to find us.
You would have torn her away from her people and her family. You would have lived in poverty and let your children grow up nameless and afraid. Every day you would expect the vengeance of Fengor to reach after you.
Rune bit back his sarcastic reply.
Has it not reached after me these past cycles?
He wanted to ask.
And for what? Because I had dared love something he had only lusted after.
Instead, he remained motionless, willing the man to carry on speaking, for he wanted to hear these excuses as much as he did not. He wanted to reject them, even while he knew they could be true.
Fengor came to Gilrith then, as you know. Like a pack of wolves, the questers followed. Sensing their prey had little with which to resist them.
This time, Rune could not stop himself.
Oh, yes, very little. She lasted a whole season.
You have no idea. They had her in tears every night. I do not know how she kept her sanity.
Spare me.
Gary shook his head.
Yes, I will spare you. Yet I want you to know that she did not leap into Fengor's lap just like that.
He snapped his fingers.
And you did little to help with your secret meetings.
Rune started violently.
You know about that.
There was a quick nod in reply, followed by a reproachful look.
Who else?
No one I know of.
You did not speak of it?
I was never asked.
He added quickly.
Not that I would have. Though when the prince was slain outside her parlor, even I suspected you. Still she held that you were innocent.
Why then did she take sides with them?
She did not take sides with them. Everyone had sided against you. The questers, the lords, the king. What did you expect her to do? Kill herself?
No. I'd only expected her to believe me, where I could not even expect that of you.
I will admit that I was confused. But my father spoke for you at the council, and there I realized you had to be innocent. But there was no reprieve for Aethera. She had given herself to Fengor mostly out of fear. All her fears came true then, for he destroyed you anyhow.
Not quite.
Gary looked at him oddly.
Oh yes, you said it yourself. The man I knew is dead.
Rune felt the heavy wings of injustice and hopelessness beat around him yet again. He sat down next to Gary, every fiber of his being regretting his decision to travel to Gilreth once more. Had he not suspected the past would find him here? And he had believed himself strong enough to smile at the many ghosts.
Why did she make that confession?
His tired voice revealed the utter mental fatigue behind this question, which he had asked 1,000 times and wrestled with through 1,000 sleepless nights.
Why tell them I was with her?
She spoke the truth. It was a truth council.
It was everything but a truth council. Did the truth come out? Did it?
Did you want her to lie?
But she did lie. I never saw her that final night.
Gary gave a start. He looked over at Rune, shock plainly written on his face.
You did not? Imran's sweet revenge.
He buried his face in his hands.
She said it to protect you.
Protect me? She condemned me. There they had a witness at last who contradicted what I had said and placed me right where they wanted me. She condemned me.
How did the questers let such an untruth pass?
Gary's voice was filled with incredulity.
Can you not guess? Do you still believe in the rot they told you as a child?
There was no need to answer. Rune continued.
You hold there was no scheme behind Fengor's move. I can understand that he wanted me destroyed out of jealousy and spite. But still he sits today with a convenient claim on these lands also. Does this not trouble you?
Gary frowned at him in incomprehension. Then he lowered his eyes.
You mean the child she bore him?
Yes, the first. I heard Imran had been merciful enough not to allow the second to live.
You are most cruel. When her second son was stillborn, a part of her died with him. After that tragedy, she became more and more reclusive. As for her first,
A sad smile played round the lined mouth.
he is dead. Murdered in the hills outside Belruth.
There was something strange in Gary's eyes, as if he had said it merely to test the other's reaction.
What?
Rune could not conceal his shock.
By whose hand?
Men from Aaron, it is claimed.
Rune gaped at him.
Is my cursed brother's rule slipping, that he cannot keep his own son safe around his city?
Gary looked away.
They said he was headstrong and reckless, that he deceived his protectors, gave them the slip. They had set someone to watch him.
Rune was slowly shaking his head.
They killed him because he was Athera's child.
The statement fell like a stone between them. By the stunned look on the other's face, he knew that this was what the man secretly believed. Gary had paled, his eyes bored into Rune's.
They had not merely killed him. It had been a sacrifice. You should have seen the body.
Men of Aaron.
There was a mocking smile on Rune's lips. Gary nodded quietly.
You said it. Yet they had an explanation for everything. But if there had been some conspiracy, it has come to nothing.
The silence lengthened between them as Rune did not dispute this claim. How futile it was to talk of things best forgotten. All it achieved was to brighten one's foolishness, or vaguely justify one's actions.
Why did you meet me here, Gary?
I do not deserve your hatred, Rune. I have always remained your friend.
Do not attempt to rob me of my hate.
Rob you? You speak as if it is something you treasure.
It is all I treasure, for it will bring me the satisfaction I crave.
She is dead. Would you hate her still?
Rune did not reply. He sat staring, his face a mask of determination. At last he said,
I hold no hatred for you.
I wanted you to know that Athera does not deserve it either.
The words were low and barely audible, as if he hardly dared speak them out loud. Rune spoke slowly and almost mechanically, as though the words had lain in his mind for a long time.
Now there is nothing left of her. There seems little sense in it.
Gary waited for more, but had to be satisfied with this cryptic reply. He accepted it in silence, quickly reading the meaning he had wanted in them, and deciding that his efforts had not been entirely wasted. His heart felt cleared of a deep burden, and if that was the case for him, he was sure the other man would feel the same. Rune hardly had time to shrug off the weariness of his emotional confrontation with Gary before he had to indulge in the next. Undoubtedly, Count Byrand would also like to justify his actions, or lack thereof, before the exile could return to his wandering. He did not allow the Count to gain any moral high ground by claiming he had done the best for Nuria and his family under the circumstances, and playing down Rune's claims as selfish and idealistic. He had heard these arguments before, when they had trampled his betrothal underfoot. He had even used them against himself in those first unholy days of Fengor's intrusion. Then they had served, as now they would, only to inflame his desire and need. Instead, he launched a bitter attack on Byrand's support of Fengor's schemes, and even went as far as to put part of the blame for Athera's death on the Count's head. He was satisfied to see the anger mount in the older man, and enjoyed the anguish and pain his efforts caused. Yet Byrand would not be deterred from whatever his goal was for the meeting, and he swallowed his ire with an extreme effort. Rune changed his tack in the hope of upsetting him again.
You let him get away with the murder of your grandchild?
The man's reaction was different to what he had expected.
Gary told you this?
Rune made no reply.
He is young, and there are many things he does not understand. Like you, he is rash at times, and will act before careful thought has guided him.
Byrand looked at the lined face for a long moment. His eyes were sad, sympathetic, but calculating, like those of a physician about to cauterize a wound.
Athera's child is not dead.
He paused, exploring the shock and puzzlement on the other's face.
He eluded the assailants and escaped to Aaron. I have had tidings only recently. Fengor may have been involved in the attempted murder. He wished to use it as a pretext to invade Aaron. He has called for a muster.
Rune spoke at last. It was clear that he was not quite convinced.
The body?
A shepherd boy, who bore a resemblance to the prince. Not that it mattered afterward.
And Fengor would kill his own son?
He smiled wryly.
Why not? It had belonged to Athera.
We called for a truth council.
He saw Rune wince at the words.
But were refused for lack of witnesses.
Why have you not told your son? Why leave him in distress?
You know him. He will give away what I know in a heated moment in the council rooms. I cannot afford this, not now.
Why tell me? Do you really care what I think of you?
Yes, I do. But that is not the reason for sharing my confidences with you.
If his voice had been low before, now it dropped almost to a whisper.
I had this information from Karth, who protects the boy in Erin. Since you are also in his employ, I cannot help but wonder at his eventual designs. To say the least, I do not completely trust him.
He glanced about him as if he was afraid of his own words.
Rune, you have been a son to me. I spoke for you against the banishment. Once you held me in high regard. I need to know what this man is up to.
Rune had caught his breath. He was too astonished to be perplexed.
What game are you playing?
You will be well paid.
I am not a mercenary.
I was not referring to gold only.
What else do you have to bargain?
The throne of Nuria.
Old man, you speak madness.
Rune's thoughts were in a jumble of confusion. Was this some sort of test of his loyalty? Had Karth put the Count up to this? He should have made a better offer then.
I will never live in Nuria again, much less wear its crown.
No, no.
Byrand raised a restraining hand as if the man in front of him would sprout wings and fly away.
I can clear your name. I know the truth of what happened. I have proof that your hand did not slay your brother.
You do?
Rune's voice had turned to ice.
That is convenient.
Do not blame me. I acquired this knowledge only recently, and quite by chance.
Even so, you would have to force the Questers to admit to their duplicity at the Truth Council, something they would never dream of doing. And Fingbor, do you think he would let a claim such as yours go unchallenged? If you are convinced of my innocence, you are also now aware of what he is capable of.
Byrand waved his hand as though brushing aside these considerations.
Fingbor is tiptoeing on a slippery ledge with his meddling in Ligerium. I am not entirely blinded to his scheming. He plans to topple Tregoran from the throne and set up a puppet in his place, or even worse, to annex Ligerium and Estium as Nurian provinces.
Rune raised his eyebrows at this. His voice betrayed his disbelief.
Surely not. Has he lost his mind?
The Count smiled wryly.
You may well ask. Or it may simply be that his ambition is waxed greater even than in his youth. Combined with that of the aging High Quester, it may reach higher than sanity would permit. Why else is he stirring the embers of the old hatred against Erin? Does he not wish to be hailed as its conqueror? Yet he knows from the previous attempt that we lack the numbers to hold it. These numbers he plans to acquire in Ligerium.
Rune was slowly shaking his head.
What makes him think Ligerium will submit to his designs? A crazy scheme, if I ever heard one.
Be that as it may, there are many in Nuria who do not support these policies, and will be outraged if they learned of this one. We are closer to peace with Erin than we have been in 100 cycles. He knows this. That is why he grasps at any wild rumor and possibility, such as the supposed death of the prince.
He studied the skeptical face before him.
If we time it right, we may depose him without the shedding of blood. But you do not seem convinced of my words.
You will need irrefutable proof of his scheming, and of the High Quester's involvement. This is no slight task. You will face powerful enemies. Do you believe you are up to it?
Byrand frowned heavily.
I will need to know whether I can count on you. If I lead a conspiracy against the king, people will accuse me of trying to usurp the throne. But when I press your claim, they will believe in the sincerity of my cause. Without you, there is little chance of success.
Rune turned away to gaze at the distant rooftops. He found it hard to believe what he had heard. Was it possible that the past could be undone? That his cycles of exile could be erased, his name and honor restored? He dared not hope for such things, for such a foolish hope could destroy one's mind. Had he not fought against this terrible ache with all his might? Had he not conquered his need for a miraculous return? Yet the mighty surge of hope he felt at Byrand's words could now hardly be fended off. Did he still need to be Nurian? The idea filled him with revulsion. Suddenly, he could imagine the shouting masses welcoming back the exile into their midst, while not too long before they had cursed his memory and yearned for the shedding of his blood. Would he revel in such duplicity? Would he give them an opportunity to make amends? No, he would not. He would see them suffer and beg under the heel of some oppressor first. Perchance then he would deign to notice their entreaties for help, and he would find the greatest pleasure in turning them down. Byrand interpreted his long silence for uncertainty. He took a step closer, his face a mask of concern.
You do not trust me, I see. That is understandable.
He sighed and drew a neatly folded length of parchment from his sleeve.
Let me earn your trust, then.
He held it out for Rune to take.
This letter was delivered to me by one of your men. I take it you were unaware of it.
The letter had been sealed and stamped with Karth's insignia. Rune skipped past the carefully polite introductions and greetings to where he believed the real message commenced. He was familiar already with the flamboyant scrawl of his employer.
I will send a battle priest to train you in the art during the first 10 days of great cost. There is much to learn and little time. Every man who possesses enough strength should be taught to wield a blade or a steel sword. Train every boy in archery, down to the age of 10, your woman too, if you have bows to spare. Stock up piles of arrows and pitch. When it comes, it will not be a war. It will be a struggle for survival. Do not train your men only for defense. It may well be that you will have to rush to the aid of your less prepared countrymen elsewhere. If that be so, leave the very old, the very young, and the woman to defend your city. March with all you have, and with grave caution, to Belruth. My captains have knowledge of how to deal with what you will encounter. Do not fail in these instructions, and do not delay your preparations. With your awakening, I shall consider my debt repaid. I have sent a large supply of lesser blades from the hand with Lord Rune's caravan. These are concealed within the casks of vinegar. Do not marvel at these last items. You will be instructed in their use. Without them, you cannot hope to face the worst of your opponents. About Lord Rune. Do not trust him yet. He is still unconvinced and willfully blind. I hope in time to gain his undeserved allegiance. As for now, he should not know the finer points of our plans. Your only ally in these dark times, Karth, Lord of Herne-in-Wrath.
Byran looked at him like an eager apprentice awaiting praise.
To what debt is he referring? If we place the entire region on the war footing, will Belruth not see it in a suspicious light? Will it not seem to them that we are about to defy their rule? Is that perhaps what Lord Karth wants? How would we conceal the fact that we are practicing the art once more? This alone will stir up the hornet's nest in Belruth.
Rune looked at him in silence. He was still trying to digest what he had learned from the letter, and needed to order his thoughts before he could decide one way or another. So, he was not to be trusted. Or had the old man merely said that to prevent a conspiracy between him and Byran? Perchance he had counted on Byran showing him the letter. He certainly would not put this past the scheming old sorcerer. He would stay as close to neutrality as he could, and pick his words with care.
If there is indeed trouble brewing in the south, it cannot be to your disadvantage to be prepared. Furthermore, Karth seems to imply that your preparations are not for the safety of Gilreth alone, but for all of Nuria. It thus seems unlikely that he would desire to drive a wedge between you and Belruth. What you are to do is in support of the king.
A horrible suspicion suddenly took hold of him. If Karth meant for Belruth to be saved, how would he keep his promise to Rune? Did he even intend keeping it? Fengor would defend himself with Gilreth's strength, despite being caught off guard. He would keep his crown, unless the powers arrayed against Nuria were overwhelmingly huge. He was ready to accept any alliance to strengthen his position. Yet, if there was a test, he would not fail it now.
I will not be your spy in Karth's household.
He saw the other's face drop.
However, if he is playing you false or means you harm, I will let you know of it.
He rose to his feet.
In return, you will keep your proof, till one day I may require it of you. But the crown you can keep, for I have no desire to rule this cursed realm.
Only once he had crossed the River Aen at Store did Rune relax his watchfulness. He had traveled only by night, thus to make use of the main roads without the irritation of his disguise. Yet here in northern Ligurium, he was much less likely to be recognized or questioned, and he could risk sleeping under a roof again. He appreciated the time alone, for there was much to think on. He had discovered, to his dissatisfaction, that he had not been able to sever all connections with his past, and yet his resolve had only been slightly shaken. He was still the same man who had crossed this river a season before. What if he felt a little sympathy for the men in Gilrath? He would admit to himself that his hatred had been tempered since he had spoken with them, but their words and attitudes had only reaffirmed his beliefs. Every man in Nuria only sought his own good, and he would do the same. Despite himself, Rune had savored the taste of Nurian air, and the sights of his youth had stirred in him an ache for what he would never have again. Curse Fingor and his duplicity, curse the people for believing him, and above all, curse that traitorous woman who had taken his heart and vow to cast them aside so easily.